This week on the APUSH Show, we're looking at Chapter 16, The Conquest of the Far West. We're going to look at societies of the Far West. Were there a whole lot of societies? Was there just one society that dominated all the other societies? And if there was, I wonder what race they were and if they were fair about it. That's a mystery. We'll also look at the changing Western economy. How did it change as the years went on? Did people adjust to it well, or were some people left in the dust? Literally. We'll also look at the romance of the West. Why was the West so alluring? Why do we like it so much? Is that romance real, or is it all a big fraud made to leave us heartbroken? We'll also look at the dispersal of the tribes. Native Americans lived in the West, and as white settlements continued, tribe dispersal became a huge thing. And lastly, we'll look at the rise and decline of the Western farmer, which is a lot like the rise and decline of Rome, except it was a lot more quick and it was a lot more folksy. All this and more this week on the APUSH Show. Chapter 16 takes a turn for the West as we take a little pause in examining issues of industrialism, classicism, federalism, racism in the East to look at the West, which had none of those issues. Not! Ha! Got him, Taft! Ha ha! Now we have to understand a few things about the West. One, the West essentially refers to the parts of the United States that are east of places like Missouri, Texas, and Iowa, but there's definitely a bit of overlap in some of those places. Two, the United States has always had a fascination with the West. It's a place of vast landscapes, highly variant terrains, exotic animals and plants, wide open spaces where law and civilization were often scarcely found. Three, it's a place seen as full of opportunity for people in the East who struggled to find success. It was also a place for escape for many who had to leave the East because they messed up bad with the law, with banks, with society, with all sorts of things that made people say, yikes, I'm going to move west, change my name, and just become a new guy. Or gal. And considering how limited information and transportation technology was back then, who was to know? Back then you could literally move like 50 miles away and become a totally different person and nobody would know the difference. What a time to be alive. Lastly, the West had loads of diverse people as we consider the Native Americans, growing Asian populations, as well as migrating whites and blacks from the East, all would come together to forge a unique society within the growingly diverse cultural landscape of the United States. Was the West really much more wild than the East and the South? I'd say based on what we've seen in the last few chapters, both the East and the South were pretty wild in their own right. Right, Taft? You are wild. So we begin our examination of the West as we look at the various societies that existed within the West. We'll start with an examination of the Native American tribes that were already living there. By the end of the Civil War, the area had become more diverse than it had ever been with the infusion of eastern tribes like the Cherokee and Creek, who had been forcibly removed from the United States government. Along with Apaches, Navajos, Pueblos, and Comanche tribes, a rich network of native cultures lived in the West, though in much fewer numbers as disease decimated their populations for generations after the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. In addition to these natives, there were also a large amount of Mexican settlers living in the West who remained there after Mexico ceded the territory after the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. Out of this mix of native and Mexican cultures emerged a sort of caste system. When we describe a caste system, we're describing a society in which it is nearly impossible for a person to move within the social hierarchy, meaning if you're poor, you stay poor. If you're born powerful, you stay powerful. If you're born rich, you stay rich. More often than not, there's a racial component there as well. In the West, caste was a reality, as the most rich and powerful members of society were generally Mexican settlers who had more direct ancestral lineage to Spain. Next, you had the Pueblo tribe, who had forged alliances with these Spanish Mexicans. Then at the bottom were native tribes tribes who were sometimes enslaved as they had been defeated in war against the Pueblo-Mexican alliance. We see that the caste system would become more complex as racial mixing occurred between the groups. In a lot of ways, it reflected the race-based caste system prevalent throughout Latin America. And it's important to remember that the United States certainly isn't the only society guilty of racism and classism, past or present. The largest native group was the Plains Indians, who were a collection of fairly diverse native tribes. They lived predominantly in the Plains states, as the name would suggest. They built cultures based on close and extended family networks, as well as religions based on nature-based notions of spirituality. Sometimes we call that sort of religious culture animism, which is sort of a worship of various nature spirits. They would establish gender norms based on work. Women tended to gathering and farming when societies were settled, and men took the role of hunters, warriors, and officiating over religious matters. Of great importance to these tribes was the buffalo. Hunting the large animals was a massive part of the native people of the plains. They used buffalo for everything. They ate the meat, used the skin and hair for clothing, used the bones for knives and arrow tips, used the sinews for strings, and even used the poop as fuel for fires. They traveled in pursuit of the buffalo as the animals roamed, would maybe settle briefly if they needed to, camped out in teepees, and leave almost no trace as they broke camps, since respect for nature was very much a thing of the native peoples living in the plains. But despite the Plains natives' remarkable aptitude for hunting and warfare, they had massive weaknesses. One, they were often too occupied fighting one another than to unify and consolidate to fight white settlers. Two, the natives never became immune from being decimated by European diseases, especially smallpox. The same disease that destroyed the population centuries earlier would prove to still be a deadly nuisance in the late 19th century. And though the most populated areas of Mexico remained under Mexican control, the areas gained by the United States after the Mexican War still contained a large amount of Spanish Mexicans and natives who lived under Mexican rule. A wealthy class of landowners had established themselves in large cities like Santa Fe, as numerous small farmers who worked for these landowners, usually scraping out a subsistence farming lifestyle. But as white settlers moved in, Hispanics in New Mexico grew nervous. At first, it wasn't much of an issue, as most white settlement was far away from Hispanic settlement. The U.S. government also succeeded at ending attacks from Apaches, Navajo, and other natives who were engaging in raids, as their very real worries about their way of life being destroyed would continue. But as white settlement continued in New Mexico, so did hostilities between whites and Hispanics, which I'm kind of ashamed the book still uses the term Hispanic, but that's what they use, so I'm just going to use it at the beginning so you're just aware of it. For the most part, I will use the term Latino. Again, I apologize for the book's lack of awareness of common nomenclature for the Latino community. After the initial New Mexican government intentionally refused to seat any non-white people as one of their nearly 1,000 officials, Latinos and natives alike grew worried. In 1847, the Taos Indians would rebel, killing the governor and numerous other officials until the United States Army subdued the rebellion. New Mexico would be under military rule for the following 3 years. Mexican Americans would continue to resist white encroachment and find some rare instances of success in certain areas like Nevada. But despite resistance, white settlement would dramatically increase into the Southwest. But with the new settlement came new economic opportunities, which would attract another wave of Mexican migrants, who would come into the region now as an oppressed group under a government and society that promoted white supremacy. We also have to remember that as white settlers moved in massive numbers west, they not only encountered Native Americans, but they encountered Mexican Americans as well, who had found themselves residents in a country that had just recently won the land underneath their feet. Indeed, for many Mexican Americans in the late 19th century, they never crossed any border. Rather, the border crossed them. Before white migration, much of the Mexican settlements in what is now the southwest of the United States settled there as Spanish missions. Missions are church efforts to spread the religion, which usually involved converting the natives, coercing or forcing those natives into labor and building large churches like the San Javier Mission in Tucson, Arizona, pictured here, which is a favorite of my mother's. But missions would decline in the 1830s as the Mexican government began to work to undo the power of the church. When the United States took over, many missions ceased to operate and many had been taken over by private ownership. Mexicans and Latinos living in the Southwest would also see their status be significantly endangered because of white settlement. In places like California, white people came in such large numbers that Californios could not resist them. Whites, through exclusion, fraud, corruption, and sometimes violence, would seize a lot of the best land and opportunities for fortune. The same thing would happen to Latinos living in Texas, and sometimes they resisted, as was the case in the raids of Juan Cortina, who freed Mexican prisoners in Brownsville, Texas in 1859. But such incidences were rare, as Latinos found themselves pushed to the lower rungs of the social ladder. Another growing group in the West were the Chinese. In the 19th century, China was undergoing what has been commonly termed as the century of humiliation. So many Chinese humbly resigned to move across the Pacific to places like Canada, the United States, Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean as indentured servants known as coolies. At first, many white Americans welcomed the Chinese migrants as hardworking, industrious people. And of course, later Americans began to resent these hardworking, industrious people because they were threatening to displace certain white people from their positions of power. And 19th century white people are going to do 19th century white people things and use white supremacy to maintain their power and privilege within society. Laws would be passed to exclude the Chinese from certain industries like mining, and outright white hostility would push the Chinese away from many other industries as well. One occupation that was welcome to the Chinese was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Railroad companies would recruit the Chinese specifically because they were hardworking, and more importantly, they were desperate and ignorant of labor organizations at the time, which meant that they weren't going to organize to form a union. American companies back then loved to hire workers who didn't have the means to organize and form labor unions. Thank goodness American companies don't do that sort of thing nowadays. There were a few rare instances in which the Chinese would fight back against the railroad companies, which often had about 90% of their labor force made up of Chinese people. There was one strike in 1866 in which 5,000 Chinese workers went on strike demanding higher wages and a shorter workday. But the company used strike breakers, starved out the striking workers, and it failed. Once the railroad was completed in 1869, many former Chinese workers, along with new migrants, would flock to the cities in the West. Like countless other ethnicities before and after, the Chinese migrants would form ethnic enclaves. An ethnic enclave is an area of a city where a large number of people who migrated from a certain country would settle together. Here, a community would form to help people settle disputes, find jobs, find friends, find housing, find places of worship, find protection from outside forces that wanted to do harm, establish local shops that sold goods like the ones back home, and engage in common cultural practices from back home like holidays, feasts, festivals, sporting events, and all other sorts of things. We call Chinese ethnic enclaves Chinatowns. Very clever, I know. The Chinese would often take on unskilled labor jobs on farms and factories, as well as domestic service jobs. They would also take on the job of owning and operating laundromats. And this wasn't because washing clothes is rooted in Chinese culture or anything like that. It was more because there are often no other jobs available to the Chinese. Because of this exclusion, Chinese would do what so many other excluded non-white groups in the United States would do: take part in illegal enterprise in order to make money. Illegal crime syndicates known as tongs would engage in all sorts of mafia-type activity like theft, extortion, drug dealing, and prostitution. Prostitution was a major issue within the Chinese community, as virtually all female migrants from China came as prostitutes. By 1880, nearly half of the Chinese women living in California were prostitutes. White and Chinese efforts to end prostitution were largely unsuccessful. The only successful effort at ending prostitution was balancing out the ratio of males to females within the Chinese community, as birth rates and migration balanced out that ratio in the early 20th century. But as Chinese migration became more constant between 1860 and 1870, so did hostility towards Chinese migrants from Americans. Anti-coolie clubs would emerge as movements to boycott Chinese-made products. The political value of spewing hatred towards the Chinese gained greater political value nationwide as more and more white laborers grew to resent Chinese workers who often accepted lower wages, thus undercutting efforts from organized labor to raise wages and increase better working conditions. Anti-Chinese fears grew until pressure on Congress became so great that they would pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which banned Chinese immigration for 10 years and prohibited Chinese already living here from becoming citizens of the United States. When the 10 years expired in 1892, the act was extended another 10 years. In 1902, the law became permanent, and as a result, the Chinese population in the United States would decline by 40%. The Chinese did have modest forms of resistance, as they were as confused as they were outraged at the level of discrimination aimed at them. Some would argue that the Chinese came from an advanced civilization and should thus be respected for what their people were able to accomplish. Others would argue that the Chinese were much more hardworking, more law-abiding, more sober, and cleaner than other marginalized groups like African Americans, Italians, or the Irish. Was that true? Probably not, but that's the argument they went with. But protestations and letter campaigns and arguments rooted in racial prejudice for other marginalized groups would prove to not be enough, as the Chinese would continue to be discriminated against by the American people and the American government. A full-on avalanche of Western migration occurred in the years following the Civil War, as what had been a trickle of thousands became a deluge of millions looking to settle in the West. Migrants from the East, as well as immigrants from European countries like Germany, Russia, Ireland, Czechoslovakia, as well as countries in Scandinavia, would head west to forge a new life. Migrants would be encouraged to become a part of the market economy of the nation, which was now more connected than ever thanks to a transcontinental railroad and a growing nationwide network of telegraph wires. Government policies would encourage Western settlement in the Homestead Act as well as government aid. The Homestead Act declared that a farmer could gain 160 acres of land as long as they paid a small fee, lived on the land, and improved it for 5 years. Nearly 400,000 farmers were able to gain land in this way, but more were unable as the cost of establishing a farm in the unsettled West proved to be too costly to be sustainable over the long term. In what would prove to become a repeated practice, Western farmers would look to the government for assistance. The government would respond in kind as they would pass the Timber Culture Act of 1873, which granted government aid if a farmer planted 40 trees on their farm. They would also pass the Desert Land Act of 1877, which granted aid if farmers were able to properly irrigate their farmland. And here we see an interesting link between American farmers and government practices that are socialist in nature, but we'll save our deep dive an examination of the United States' long and complicated history with the S word, that is, socialism. Got something you want to say about socialism? I didn't think so. With the flush of new settlers came changes to the economy of the West. With railroads and telegraphs connecting the continent, the West would become more part of the greater United States market economy, with large Eastern corporations controlling huge parts of the growing Western industries of mining, cattle ranching, and agriculture. Man, these companies in the East sure seem to be owning a whole lot of stuff in the United States, Taff. Do you think that's going to be a problem later? Labor in the West was a tricky proposition, as recruiting a labor force to move out in largely unsettled areas was difficult. Employment was often fragile for a working-class white worker, as a job could be lost once a harvest was collected, a railroad finished, a mine played out, or a herd sent to market. Not to mention that oftentimes Chinese workers were hired over whites, as they were often willing to work for lower wages than what a white man would accept at that time. In addition to these hardships, there was also the grueling reality that the West was not the limitless land of gold and opportunity that many had come to expect. More often than not, those who moved west with a good deal of money would be the ones who would hold the higher positions in society, and those who did not have a whole lot of money continued to toil and struggle in the working classes. It was also a heavily male area, as it had the highest rate of single adult males in the country. In the country. And usually when there's a lot of single adult working class males, there's going to be a lot of... No, not cat food stores. Prostitutes, Taft. prostitutes. There were a great deal of jobs available for women in the form of dance hall workers or in prostitution. And here we see a parallel between white workers moving west and the experience of Chinese migrants who also settled in the West. Both were heavily male populations, and both would seek the comforts of prostitutes in the days of settling the West. In addition to being largely male, the working class of the West was also highly diverse and highly racially stratified. Again, remember that stratified means layers. So if a cake is stratified, that means it is a layer cake with different layers. Frosting, the cake part, other cake part. White, black, Filipino, Chinese, Native American, and Latino workers would often work side by side, but oftentimes skilled positions or positions in management would be held only by whites, and more arduous positions in mining and agriculture would be held by people of color. Certain bogus racial stereotypes would be developed by white management to help maintain this white supremacy. They would argue that because Chinese, Filipino, and Mexican workers were smaller and from more tropical climates, that they were more suited to work in the sun or in the heat of the mines more so than whites. Whites, of course, would accept this theory because it put them in a higher social position than other people, and it would often keep them from having to work the hottest and most dangerous jobs. In a similar vein to the California gold rush, mining would attract thousands to the West beginning around 1860 until its relatively abrupt conclusion in the 1890s. A mining boom was remarkably cyclical. Some sort of precious metal would be discovered, scores of prospectors would come in and extract said precious metal from surface areas like the ground or panning shallow rivers. After all that was exhausted, a commercial mining company would come in with better equipment and would come in and dig deeper for more minerals. When those materials were exhausted, the mining would generally dwindle away and farmers and ranchers would move in and settle in the area. Mining booms would dot the landscape of the West as gold and silver would be discovered, miners would rush in, gold and silver would be extracted, a few people made a profit, most did not, towns would be built, and large swaths of the West would be developed in this way. In instances like the Comstock lode in the Washoe district of Nevada, whole communities would develop as gold and silver were often found in remote areas where there was literally nothing. Everything, including food, shelter, and in some cases water, had to be transported in from a nearby town. But many western towns would develop in the wake of mining booms, and as is the case in most newly settled areas, the gender imbalance was considerable. The vast majority of people coming in were men, and the few women who came in were usually wives. A young single man in this area, and there were quite a few young single men in this area, had very few female prospects his age. And when you have very few female prospects and a whole lot of young single men, that makes it a ripe market for... I don't know if I like you using that word so comfortably. You're too young to use that word. You're only 7. Mining was also incredibly dangerous. Mines were ridiculously hot, usually around 100 degrees when inside of one. They were usually poorly ventilated and full of poisonous fumes. Cave-ins were frequent as well, and on average, 1 in every 30 miners was injured on the job, and 1 in 80 was killed on the job. Mining. It's so metal, bro. Along with mining, raising cattle was another huge aspect of the growing Western economy. The Great Plains was often a very large, open grassland, which was ideal for cattle to graze. The cattle itself, as well as the occupation of cowboy, had Spanish and Mexican origins. The horses and cattle themselves were actually brought over to the Americas first by the Spanish and would later be bred over centuries by Mexican cattle drivers. Many of the methods and tools associated with being a cowboy and raising cattle were developed by Mexicans, and pretty much every horse used by cowboys and Native Americans were derived from the Spanish-bred Mustang. In order to get the cattle to the rest of the United States, they had to be driven on land to railheads in places like Abilene, Kansas, via trails. The Chisholm Trail was one of those sorts of trails, and cowboys and cattle drivers would move cattle by land to the railheads, where the cows could then be processed and sent to meat processing facilities in the east, many of which were actually located right here in Chicago. Even though only a fraction of the cattle will withstand a long cattle drive to the north, investing in cattle drives was extremely lucrative at first. It was said that an initial investment of $5,000 could result in $45,000 profit. Because the demand of cattle increased and the amount of space for trails decreased as more and more farms emerged and got settled, separate trail routes would emerge as well. But after a few bad winters and dry summers would spark the beginning of the end of the cattle drive, the final blow to this industry would be replacing cattle drives with a much safer and more efficient and consistent means of transporting cattle: railroads. The demand for beef never went away, as the demand for it would spark continued use of large ranches, which would breed more and more heads of cattle. As the Western economies of farming, ranching, and mining helped grow cities and states, women would find a few scarce political opportunities in this region as well. Wyoming would be the first state to guarantee suffrage to women, and many other states would follow suit shortly thereafter. The Mormons, who would settle and essentially run Utah, would grant suffrage to women as a PR move to try and silence criticism for their use of polygamy, which again means to have multiple wives. Other states would grant suffrage to women to increase the number of eligible voters in order to meet statehood requirements. Some were persuaded by the argument that women were more gentle and benevolent, and the West kind of needed that thing. And maybe it did. I mean, it was the Wild West after all. Maybe it needed a woman's touch. What do you think, Taft? Well, I suppose you have a point there. Which brings us to the United States' love affair with the West, which has been around ever since the first European settlers settled way back when in Virginia. People were fascinated with the vast expanse of nature and seemingly limitless possibilities that the West offered. The West seemed like an infinite escape from the trappings of civilization in the East. Though the West certainly provided its own share of unique challenges, Americans have always been in love with how much more green and natural the grass seemed on the West side compared to the Eastern side. A big part in this cultural promotion of the West came in the production of vast Western landscape paintings done by artists like Albert Bierstadt and Thomas Moran, who were a part of what was known as the Rocky Mountain School. This was a similar movement in landscape painting to the Hudson River Valley School that had captured the imagination of Americans in the early days of the Republic. Except these images were a bit more grand, as the landscapes of the Rocky Mountains are a bit more dynamic than the Hudson River Valley landscapes. Sorry, Taft is a big-time Hudson River Valley guy. Big-time Hudson River Valley stan. That was quite the outburst. But perhaps the most powerful and enduring aspect of culture to emerge from the West is the cowboy. No, not that type of cowboy. The type that actually drove cattle and didn't regularly embarrass the fine folks of Dallas, Texas on a weekly basis. Thanks to novels like The Virginian, written by Owen Wister in 1902, the cowboy became the symbol of the independent American spirit. A cowboy was strong, in tune with nature, cunning, courageous, and usually a force for good. In reality, cowboys were severely underpaid, highly uneducated and ignorant, lived lonely, tedious, and uncomfortable lives with little chance of moving up in society. But the myth of the cowboy has been striking a nerve with Americans and beyond for well over 100 years. As one of the most enduring symbols of the United States still to this day is the cowboy. The West would also be viewed as the final frontier, the last place to be settled by civilization. People like painter and sculptor Frederick Remington would romantically paint the West as being a place where a person could find himself and be free from the entrapments of the civilized world of the East. Authors like Mark Twain would craft stories that would depict characters that escaped into the natural settings of the West in order to arrive at a greater consciousness and conclusion of the meaning of life in America. Sometimes these characters went west, like in Roughing It, or sometimes these characters would escape into the wilderness surrounding the Mississippi River Valley, like in Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer. Even Teddy Roosevelt would find himself in the West, as he saw it as a way to find his own self of somewhat toxic masculine self-worth and strength in order to escape the pain of the death of his young wife at the time, as well as to work out issues of inadequacy from being a sickly and asthmatic child. A young professor from the University of Wisconsin by the name of Frederick Jackson Taylor would publish a thesis to the American Historical Association in Chicago titled "The Significance of the Frontier in American History." In this essay, he would argue that the Western frontier played a role in the development and democratization of America. He would say that the West allowed for the continuous possibility of finding land of one's own and developing a new society shaped by the people who founded that land. And of course, as this was written by a white guy in the late 1890s, he pretty much only meant white guys in his thesis and would largely leave out the Native American and Mexican settlers who were already living in the West. But regardless, the idea of the last frontier would remain a part of the American understanding of the role of the West, and many legitimately worried as to what would happen when there would be no more lands to settle. What would happen when there was no longer a frontier to escape to? How would people deal with the psychological loss when people could no longer pick up, move west, and settle virgin land in the West? And the idea of the West being virgin is definitely in tune with the very creepy and rapey vibe many expressed at this time, and it's also largely a myth. Though the West was unsettled, it was no Garden of Eden, and as people moved to the West, they often quickly found that settling the area presented a great deal of challenges, many of which could be more difficult than the challenges faced in the East. And also, the West was not simply a virgin waiting for white settlers to come and take it. One, you can't really have sex with the West. That's just gross, but people use that language all the time. And two, there are already people living there, so to think that this area is untouched and unblemished is not true because there's people there. And of course, the group that was the largest and there the longest was also the most displaced group in the United States. Of course, we're talking about Native American tribes. As you may remember, the United States policy towards Native people was generally to regard them as both citizens of a sort of foreign nation who are also the responsibility of the United States government. The president, along with the Congress, would negotiate treaties with natives, force them off land in the East, allow them land in the West, which would usually also be taken away to give in to white pressure for more land. We see this in the concentration policy of the United States beginning around 1851. In this policy, natives would be allotted huge pieces of land in which they would live. These lands would be called reservations, and they did a lot to help white settlement, but little for the natives themselves. Later on, the concentration policy would be replaced as two large reservations, one in Oklahoma and one in the Dakotas, would become the territory for the natives. This was arrived after several bloody conflicts between natives and settlers and after the United States representatives tricked, lied, bribed, and cajoled members of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Sioux, and other tribes into acceptance. These officials who presided over these territories were usually either poorly prepared or corrupt. As these positions were often granted as patronage, usually these officials were incredibly corrupt, like in the Indian Ring scandal during the Grant administration. Well-intended officials simply had little idea of how tribal life worked. One of the worst policies was towards the buffalo, in which these animals, which were the life sources for numerous tribes, would be hunted en masse for the sake of clearing the way for railroads as well as for their leather and fur. Hunting buffalo became sort of a sport, but this would have catastrophic effect on the species as the number of buffalo would dwindle from about 15 million in 1865 to less than 1,000 10 years later. Natives would see the attack as an attempt to eradicate their entire way of life. And when people think their way of life is being threatened, they're going to fight back in very, very violent and desperate ways. Native resistance would emerge with great intensity after the Civil War, as natives would experience some of the worst atrocities committed against them by the United States government. Natives would stage raids on camps, stagecoaches, and trains in order to resist further intrusion on their land. In one act of resistance, natives in Minnesota would stage a rebellion against white policy under the leadership of Little Crow. Over 700 whites would be killed until the rebellion was put down by a militia. 38 natives would be hanged, and the tribe would be exiled to the Dakotas. Violence grew particularly follow in Sand Creek, Colorado, when the governor ordered friendly natives to meet at Army posts for protection after a large amount of native raids on stagecoaches had occurred. Believing his tribe was under protection under this policy, Chief Black Kettle took his tribe to camp at Sand Creek near Fort Lyon. A militia of unemployed miners, many of whom were apparently drunk, under the command of Colonel J.M. Covington, would attack Black Kettle's tribe, massacring 133 natives, 105 of whom were women and children. Other instances of Indian hunting would occur in which people would be encouraged via bounties to hunt and kill Native Americans. As proof of their slaughter, Americans would bring back scalps or skulls of the natives they had killed. Many Americans flat out tried to exterminate the entire Native American race. In California, the population of the natives was around 150,000, but by 1870, it was reduced to 30,000. An alarming number of Americans were attempting flat-out genocide of Native Americans. These violent attacks sometimes had lulls thanks to United States policy, but the violence would come back as increased white settlement would cause further violent tensions between the whites and the natives. In the Battle of Little Bighorn, tribes united under the leadership of Chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull would leave their reservation. An expedition of over 200 U.S. troops led by General George Custer would be charged with forcing them back. A battle ensued, and the glory-hungry and shameless self-promoting Custer led his troops to slaughter, as all of his men would be killed. Though Custer escaped disgraced, the native force was not able to sustain itself due to the lack of supplies and organization. Warriors disbanded, and the united warriors that remained were forced back to the reservation. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse would be killed later on by reservation police after they were either tricked or taunted into a final show of desperate resistance. In the case of Chief Joseph, the Nez Perce were a peaceful tribe living in Oregon who, despite having never had issues with settlers of any kind, were forced off their land to live in a reservation. On their way, a few angry young natives of the tribe lashed out and killed 4 white settlers. As a result, Joseph and his tribe would be pursued as they tried to make their way to join the Sioux in Canada. Joseph would be captured under the condition that his tribe would be allowed to return to their reservation in Idaho. The government refused to honor this request, and the tribe would be moved several times, with several members dying of sickness and malnutrition along the way. As was the case in earlier cases of native decimation, religious revivalism would emerge among natives as well. In the case of the Sioux, there was a movement known as the Ghost Dance, in which tribes would engage in a dancing ritual that included incantations of visions of the retreat of the white man and a return of the buffalo. This, of course, terrified white people as they thought it was a precursor to more violence against them. But in reality, the violence would again be one-sided against the natives. In the battle at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in December of 1890, General Custer's old regiment were again sent to round up a group of natives to return them to their reservation. Fighting would break out, and over 300 natives, including women and children, would be killed in the snow compared to the 40 white soldiers that were killed in the battle. The United States government tried to destroy the cornerstone of Native society, the tribe, with the Dawes Act of 1887. This was a reversal of white policy of separating tribes from whites and reservations to one of assimilation. Assimilation is when one group changes their culture to be more like the dominant group, either voluntarily or by force. The Dawes Act would split the land on reservations up into 80-acre plots for single people and 160-acre plots for families. Though 80 acres is a lot of land, natives were not at all familiar with this sort of lifestyle or with the idea of land ownership. Children would also be taken from families to live in boarding schools in order to teach them religion, English, and basically how to be a white person in the 19th century. Not to mention the way the Dawes Act was carried out was incredibly corrupt. Shocking, I know. Very few pieces of land would actually be given out. Natives would continue to resist, and a solution to the plight and sorrow of Native Americans remained unsolved and is still largely unsolved to this day. In the final phase of white settlement in the West, after the miners, after the ranchers, after the genocidal wars against the natives, farmers began to settle the territory. For a time, agriculture boomed in the West in the 1870s and 1880s, but that wouldn't last. Railroads played a key role in this boom, as the railroad would not only bring people and supplies in, but would also bring goods out and connect the Western farmers with the larger U.S. market economy. A large network of truly transcontinental railroads would be established by 1862 and would continue to grow. The railroads were largely funded by the private companies that owned them, but they would be given large subsidies by the state governments as well as the federal government to make sure that they were up and running. Unusually heavy rainfall, along with the invention of barbed wire by two Illinois farmers, helped to make life easier for Western farmers in the beginning. The rainfall helped the plants to grow, and the barbed wire became an affordable measure to keep cattle from wandering off ranches. However, drought would soon become the undoing of the Western farmer. Rainy years gave way to dry years, and many farms badly needed irrigation in order to ensure their survival. Federal and state governments were unwilling to pay for that, and many farmers faced hard times. Unable to pay off the loans they used to purchase their farms, many banks would foreclose on these farms, and a reverse migration would occur as farmers would have to venture back east. But much like the romantic idea of the West being an unsettled place full of opportunity, the idea of the independent Western farmer also became largely mythical. Commercial agriculture would prove to outproduce small farms who could not compete. Large corporate-owned farms could afford modern equipment and farming techniques that small farmers either couldn't afford or didn't know about. Also, farm production was increasing all over the world, making the price of agricultural goods far too cheap for small farmers to make a profit. But a large corporation that had money to spend and didn't have to worry as much about interest could afford to make farming profitable and could afford to force small farmers into foreclosure so they could purchase their land and increase their market share. Farmers would be grieved by this immensely because they often couldn't see or understand the massive global capitalist forces that would render their lifestyles unsustainable. Rather than lash out at overproduction in places like India, Brazil, Argentina, or Australia, farmers would lash out at things like the railroad company that charged high fees, or how expensive harvesting machines were, or the bank for the high interest rates on their mortgages, or domestic currency policies which squeezed credit and prevented farmers from continuing to function. Lastly, there was the issue of agrarian malaise. Life on a Western farm was incredibly isolated and slow. There were usually few people to interact with, and many children who grew up in these situations would leave the first chance they got for a more exciting life in a city nearby. The allure of farming lost its luster by the 1890s as more and more farmers in the West lamented the lost dream of farming as nothing more than a slow descent into failure and ruin. Thank you guys so much for watching. We're actually taking a 2-week break because of the holiday season. It's the end of the semester, and old Mr. Weber and William Howard Taft need to rest up a bit. Thank you guys so much for watching. Those of you who've been watching this whole time, thank you so much. Maybe you've learned something. Maybe you've laughed once, maybe twice. But anyway, we're excited to pick this back up in the next year, in the next semester. But until then, we got to keep pushing, G.